Welcome to this training on homelessness history. This will be a data collection overview over fields in HMIS that collect a client's history of homelessness. We have 4 sections. First, we'll start by looking at some basic definitions. After that, we'll look at some examples of homelessness history. Then, we'll focus in on the fields that we see in HMIS and how they relate to the client's homelessness history. And finally, we'll briefly define chronicity or chronic homelessness. Let's start with definitions. On the right side, you'll see the 5 definitions we'll be looking over. Homelessness, episodes, breaks, and both institutional and permanent situations. The first important definition to understand is homelessness. So for the purpose of HMIS data collection, stays in a place not meant for habitation, a safe haven, or an emergency shelter are considered homeless situations. These are also referred to as literal homelessness. The picture on the bottom is showing an image from our software, Community Services, which will distinguish which situations are considered homeless situations. Next, we'll define episodes and breaks. Those will become really important later, so right now the definitions are important, but we'll give examples of both in the next section. So an episode is a distinct period of homelessness separated by breaks in a client's experience of homelessness. So again, an episode is each distinct period of homelessness a client experiences. A break is a period when a client is no longer experiencing homelessness per HUD's HMIS guidance. There are 2 types of breaks a client might experience in their history of homelessness. The first is a break as a result of stays in permanent situations occurring after 7 days. The second is breaks in institutional situations after stays of 90 days or more. We'll get into these much more detailed examples in a little bit. We also want to review institutional situations. So for the purposes of HMIS data collection, the stays in the following 6 places are considered institutional stays. So foster care home or foster care group home, a hospital or other residential non-psychiatric medical facility, jail, prison, or juvenile detention facility, long-term care facility or nursing home, a psychiatric hospital or other psychiatric facility, and finally, substance abuse treatment facility or detox center. These institutional situations, as they appear in community services, is also pictured below. And finally, we have permanent situations. For the purposes of HMIS data collection, the stays in the following places are considered permanent situations. Please note, these are general categories. In community services itself, there are many more detailed sub-options for each of these. Generally though, a permanent situation is a rental, a property that the client owns, when a client is staying with family or friends, transitional housing, a residential product or halfway house, or a hotel or motel paid by the client's own funds and not through emergency shelter vouchers. That concludes our definitions. The next important thing we'll talk about is breaks. So we're going to go over a few different examples. We'll do a core example to set the tone. We'll look at permanent housing breaks, institutional breaks, and we'll put it all together with a scenario as though a client is visiting us and enrolling in a shelter for the first time, or at least at our shelter for the first time. So our core example, here is a timeline. Each little arrow represents 1 month, so there's a total of 12 months represented in this timeline here. At the very right, we have the start of the client's history here of 1/1/2025, and the yellow represents time spent in shelter or literal homelessness. In this case, we're considering the client to be staying in shelter for about 90 days, and this would be the first episode of the client's homelessness. Now, after 90 days, they're then couch surfing with someone that they know, let's say their brother, and they're currently in that situation for 120 days. This would be considered a break in homelessness because it separates the time between this first part of homelessness in shelter from January 1st to April 1st, and the second time the client is experiencing homelessness beginning on August 1st of 2025 in this scenario. So this is what we mean by break. We mean a client has 1 episode of homelessness, they then are no longer experiencing that homelessness, and they have a second experience of homelessness afterwards. Now, what constitutes a break is different for permanent situations and institutional situations. So let's talk about permanent housing breaks specifically. So this is a very similar scenario. In this case, the client is again experiencing 2 episodes of homelessness. And as an important note, it's considered a break in homelessness if a client stays in a permanent situation for 7 days or more. So in this situation, the client is in a shelter between January 1st and April 1st. They then stay with their brother for 30 days. And that 30 days is 7 days or more, which constitutes a break in a client's experience of homelessness per HUD's definition. After their client staying at the brother's house for about 30 days, they're again returned to the shelter for 240 days, which represents their second episode of homelessness. Now, we'll hold on that 7-day component for permanent housing because this is very similar to the previous slide. The only difference is the amount of time the client was couch surfing is 4 days instead of 30 days. As a result, this is only one episode of homelessness for the client. So in this situation, the client's in shelter between January 1st and April 1st. They stay with their brother for 4 days, but this is not long enough to constitute a break in homelessness. Once they return to the shelter on the 5th of April, this is still considered one episode of homelessness because they did not meet that break criteria. So as you can see, this is still a first episode of homelessness continued. Now in this scenario, it's very similar, and it's even more similar in terms of view. The timeline is almost identical. The only difference is this green section is a little bit longer and represents 9 days where the client was staying with their brother. So again, the client's staying in shelter for 90 days between January 1st and April 1st. In this instance, instead of staying with their brother for 4 days, they stay with their brother for 9 days. And per HUD's definition, a break is 7 days or more in a permanent housing situation. So this is no longer considered one continuous episode of homelessness. This second set of yellow now becomes the client's second episode of homelessness. We'll now review institutional situations and breaks in those situations. So this is a very similar timeline, except the blue represents time in an institutional situation. Now, if we recall, breaks in institutional situations occur when a client stay is 90 days or more. So in this case, the client again is staying in shelter for the first 3 months of the year, from January 1st to April 1st. They're then staying in a hospital for 30 days. But this is not a break because they're in a hospital or an institutional situation. If this was a permanent situation, like we previously discussed, it would be a break. But this is not a permanent situation. This is an institutional situation. So as a result, this second set of yellow is really considered to be the first episode of homelessness continued because this here does not constitute a break in the client's episode of homelessness. Now, for a second scenario regarding institutional situations, we are seeing a client having 2 episodes of homelessness. So, like in all of our other scenarios, the client is having an episode of homelessness in shelter between January 1st and April 1st. Then they stay at a hospital for 90 days, which constitutes a break in homelessness for an institutional situation. After the hospital stay, they return to homelessness, represented by this yellow section here. And as we can see, this is now the client's second episode of homelessness because this 90 days does constitute a break in terms of institutional situations. We'll go through 2 more scenarios to really hit home the point on how important that 90-day break period is. So this is a very similar graph. The only difference is that instead of the stay in the hospital being 90 days, it is now 101 days. But this is still 2 episodes of homelessness for the client. The first episode representing the stay in the shelter for the first 3 months, and the second episode being represented by this yellow section here as the second episode of homelessness. Once again, because that stay in the hospital is 90 days or more, it does constitute a break in homelessness, and now we have 1 and 2 distinct episodes of homelessness that we're recording for the client. In our final situation, again, it's a very similar situation. Again, the client staying for 90 days in shelter at the start of the year for the first 3 months. But instead of staying at a hospital for 90 days or more, the client in this situation is staying for 80 days. Now, this 80 days does not constitute a break in homelessness because it does not meet HUD definition of 90 days or more to create a break in homelessness. As a result, when we go back to this, or go to the second section of yellow after the 20th here, the 20th of June in this scenario, this is still the first episode of homelessness continued because this hospital stay did not meet that 90-day threshold and is not considered a break in homelessness. Now that's a lot of information, so we're going to bring it all together. So in those previous 3, 4, 5 slides, for permanent situations and institutional situations, we're looking at a period of 1 year. Now the homeless definition, especially with chronicity, which we'll touch base on later, does look at a client's history of homelessness for the past 3 years. So the blue in the scenario is an institutional situation, the yellow is a homeless situation, and the green is a permanent situation. In this scenario, we're meeting the client on October 1st of 2025, and we're going to talk to the client and talk with them about what their history of homelessness is, starting with the current time and moving backwards. So as we're speaking with the client, we learn that for the past 90 days, they've been staying in shelter or a literally homeless situation. This would represent an episode of homelessness with the 3 months in yellow here. After further discussion, we learned that prior to staying in the shelter, they were staying at their brother's place for 30 days. So with this information, we're still seeing 1 episode of homelessness for a total of 3 months, represented by these yellow sections right here. Prior to this green section here, where the client was staying with their brother, we learned that the client was experiencing homelessness and living on the streets for the 16 months prior to that. So we now see that this total months of homelessness has jumped up to 19 total, which is the number of yellow arrows that we have. This also represents 2 episodes of homelessness because this green here is representing 30 days. And if we recall, a break for a permanent situation is a stay of 7 days or more. So since this stay was 30 days, it definitely constitutes a break. And so we now are counting 1 episode of homelessness here for these first 3 months and these other 16 months prior to their stay with their brother. Now, after some discussion, we do learn that the client, prior to being on the street, was in a hospital for 60 days. Now, at this point, you'll notice that the episodes and the months homeless hasn't changed because we don't have enough information at this point to determine if this is another episode of homelessness before this or what the situation is. They may have been living in a permanent housing situation before this or back on the street. After some discussion, we learned prior to staying in the hospital, they were on the street once again. And so now we're going to add 3 months of homelessness to their total. Now this can get kind of specific, and we'll touch base on some of these rules later. But because this institutional stay represents 2 months or approximately 60 days, this does not constitute a break in homelessness because if you recall, a break in homelessness due to an institutional situation is for stays of 90 days or more. So as a result, all this yellow up here and this continued stay here, including the hospital, is all 1 episode of homelessness because the client did not stay in the hospital long enough for it to constitute a break. In these situations, if a client is staying in an institutional setting and it does not constitute a break, you can count those months as part of the month's homeless total. After further discussion, we see that the client, or learn that the client was staying in an apartment they rented prior to their homelessness beginning here. And as a result, we have no additional episodes of homelessness and no additional months of homelessness, but this does complete our timeline that we've gathered with the client. Next, we're going to review some fields in HMIS because it's important to understand how this data is collected and how breaks work for both permanent and institutional situations, but there are relevant fields in HMIS that help us collect that information. So first, we'll do a quick overview. The 4 questions on the screen are what we'll be really targeting. So we have, in HMIS, you will see these questions, and we'll want to hone in on the prior living situation, the approximate date this episode of homelessness started, this regardless of where they stayed last night, number of the times the client has been on the streets, in shelter or safe havens in the past 3 years, including the day you're speaking with the client, and the total number of months homeless on the street, in shelter or safe haven in the past 3 years. These questions on the very right is exactly how they will appear in community services. So just to put it all together, for prior living situation, what we're really looking at or asking is where did you sleep last night? And we'll provide more detail on this in a moment. The next question we're looking at is approximate date this episode of homelessness started. And so another way to phrase that is, you said you were sleeping last night in your car or at a shelter. When did this episode of homelessness begin? It is okay to paraphrase some of these questions to get at the actual meaning if you feel a different phrasing would better convey to the client what you're trying to gather. Oftentimes, this just needs to be part of a longer conversation, and it's really important for you to understand what these questions are, but not necessarily ask the client these questions directly. The next question we have is number of times in a homeless situation in the past 3 years. So in this case, we're going to count how many episodes of homelessness the client has experienced, and you're going to review the client's history to determine this number. It's often more effective to look at the client's history for the past 3 years and then figure out how many times they've experienced homelessness rather than asking the client directly. Finally, we have total number of months homeless, and this looks like sort of, now that we've reviewed the client's history of homelessness, we can now count how many months the client has been homeless. And we'll break this down with our timeline for each of these questions. So first, prior living situation, where did you sleep last night? So in the altogether scenario we had earlier, we met our client on October 1st, 2025, and they told us that they were staying at shelter the night before we met them. So this means their prior living situation was shelter, and this is where they were staying right prior to where they met with us. This is perhaps the most straightforward question of the 4 that we reviewed on the previous slide. The next field we'll look at is the approximate date this episode of homelessness started or began. Now, this is only for the current episode of homelessness, not all time. So, as we discussed previously, this timeline of 3 years represents 2 episodes of homelessness. This 30 days here, there's a break in a permanent situation, and this second instance of homelessness represented by all the yellow on this first line and the second line, including the blue here. When we're talking about the approximate date this episode of homelessness, we're only going back for this episode, the most recent episode of homelessness. So in this case, going back 3 months, their episode of homelessness for this time would have started on July 1st, 2025. This is not asking when they first became homeless of all time, only this episode of homelessness. Now, as a note, this current episode of homelessness can cover multiple homeless situations. As an example, the client may have stayed shelter for the past 3 months straight. Alternatively, the client might have been living in the street and then stayed at shelter for the next 2 months. In both cases, whether it's at the shelter for 3 months straight or going from a street to a sheltered situation, because every month was still a piece of literal homelessness, you would still go back to July 1st. So it's asking for when this current episode of literal homelessness began, irrespective of whether it was in the street, in a shelter, or a safe haven. The next field we'll focus on is the number of times a client's been in a homeless situation in the past 3 years. So what this is really counting is it's counting the total episodes of homelessness over the past 3 years. And this is why it's really important to understand the breaks in homelessness history and be able to distinguish between a permanent situation, which has 7-day breaks, and institutional situations, which have 90-day breaks. So in this case, the client would have 2 times homeless per this scenario. The first episode represented here, a break due to a permanent housing situation, and the second episode of homelessness here, and continued down here. This is why it's really helpful to go ahead and sit down and come up with a timeline, because looking at it this way or have it written out is much easier to gather this information and really understand how to answer these questions rather than just asking the client directly how many times they've been homeless in the past 3 years, because they may not be familiar with the 7-day breaks for permanent situations or 90-day breaks for institutional situations. The final field we'll hone in on is total months homeless, or the total number of months homeless in the past 3 years. This is simply counting the total months homeless over the past 3 years. And we can see we're just counting it with the numbers on the screen here, all the way from 1 to 22. Now, as a couple of notes, this permanent situation was a break, so we're not going to count that month as a month homeless. In this case down here with these institutional situations, this 60-day stay in a hospital did not constitute a break. As a note, time spent in institutional or permanent situations that did not result in a break in homelessness can be counted toward the total. As a result, we have 19, 20, 21, and 22 months in this situation, as this hospital stay did not constitute a break, so we're going to include those 2 months in the client's total number of months homeless. The final thing we'll talk about is chronicity, or chronic homelessness. We'll quickly go over the definition, and in addition, we'll just hit home the importance of accurate data collection. So this is just informational. Chronic homelessness is met under either scenario listed below. So in both scenarios, a client has to have a disabling condition, but for scenario 1, a client has a disabling condition, and if a client has been experiencing literal homelessness, that's in a shelter, a safe haven, or on the street, or any combination of thereof, for at least 12 months straight, the client would be considered chronically homeless. The second scenario, again, the client would have a disabling condition. In the second scenario, the client may not have had experienced literal homelessness for 12 months straight. So instead, they can qualify if over the past 3 years, the client has both experienced at least 4 episodes of homelessness and spent at least 12 months homeless over the past 3 years. There won't be a lot of work that you need to do to really define whether a client is chronically homeless. The most important thing is accurate data collection. So, the most important way to understand if a client is chronically homeless is to collect the data as accurately as possible and really get an excellent homeless history with the client. More accurate data will help with clients, it'll help with prioritization in the community and for resources, and it can help lessen the burden in collecting homeless verification should your client get a referral, especially to a PSH program. So while chronicity is a big topic and it is important, the really key part is to make sure that we're just collecting the homelessness history data correctly. And if the client is chronically homeless, because we've correctly collected the data, they will be defined as chronically homeless just because their data is saying that they do, and their history does reflect that status.